Well, it's a joy to join you today from Monroe, North Carolina, where I'm with my parents for a few days. And again, we are outside, so you have to forgive any of the sunlight and the distractions of sound or background noise that you might hear. But I am glad to be able to come to you with today's devotional. Our scripture reading is Judges chapter 14 and 15, and our title is Samson, a man of raging passions. Again, our scripture reading Judges 14 and 15. And I want to invite you to turn there with me and follow with me as we consider our devotional today. Well, the scriptures do not describe Samson's physical appearance. However, he must have been striking. Nevertheless, various artists have portrayed him as a hawk of a man with bulging muscles and longer hair, a visible testimony of his Nazarite vow. Now, the final verses of Judges chapter 13 indicated that Samson was conscious of the presence and the blessing of the Lord upon him. Indeed, it was recorded, and I'm going to quote, that the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. That's chapter 13 and verse 25. Now, no doubt it was the suffering of his brethren under the oppression of Philistine rule that stirred indignation within Samson. And so consider with me Judges chapter 14. And here I would describe for you a title, a woman, a wedding, and a riddle. Now, we'll notice in the first four verses of Judges 14 that Samson's desire for a Philistine woman. Now, he had made a brief journey from his home down to Timnath, and we read in chapter 14 and verse 1 that he saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Well, as was the custom of his day, Samson returned home and demanded of his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me to wife. Well, because the Philistines were idolatrous, Samson's parents rightfully objected to his desire to marry a Philistine woman. And so they asked their son, and I'm going to quote, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren? Now, his brethren would have been the tribe of Dan, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? Well, nonetheless, Samson's desire for the woman was undeterred, and he said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me well. Well, Judges chapter 14 and verse 4 displays for us God's sovereignty and providence, which worked through Samson's untoward desire. That is, the desire that was not pleasing to the Lord. So we read that Samson's father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Chapter 14 and verse 4. And so the stage was set for Samson to find a cause with the Philistines, and one the Lord used to set his champion to oppose the enemies of his people, once again, the Philistines. Now, in chapter 14 and verses 5 through 9, we see that legendary display of Samson's physical strength and exploits. Now, as Samson traveled to meet his future bride, we read that a young lion roared against him. And with the Spirit of the Lord upon him, we read in chapter 14, verses 5 through 9, that Samson slew the lion using only his bare hands. Well, in Timnath, Samson met with the Philistine woman he craved to marry, and he confirmed his desire to make her his wife. Well, as he journeyed home, he found the dried carcass of the lion he had slain and discovered it was filled with a swarm of bees and honey, and we read which he did eat in verses 8 through 9. Well, that brings us to verses 10 through 14 of Judges 14. Now, here we have Samson's wedding feast and a riddle for his guest. Now, Samson's father agreed for the Philistine woman to marry his son in verse 10. And after that, we find that there was a 7-day wedding feast that was held to consummate the marriage. Well, during the feast, Samson challenged his wedding guests with a riddle, and he made a wager of 30 sheets, literally 30 pairs of undergarments, and 30 change of garments. So those garments were most likely embroidered robes that were used for special feasts and occasions. Well, if his guests solved the riddle, he would provide for them those 30 embroidered robes, changes of garments. Well, on the seventh day of the feast, in chapter 14 and verse 14, we find that the wicked wedding guests threatened Samson's wife and her father if she failed to tell them the answer to his riddle. Now we come to verse 16 through 20, and here we have the betrayal of Samson's wife. Now, Samson's wife, we read, wept and pressed him to give her the answer to the riddle, and when he did, she betrayed him to the men threatening her and gave them, those men at the wedding, the answer to the riddle. Well, having learned he was betrayed, Samson was furious in verse 16, and to fulfill his promise of 30 new garments, he slew 30 men in verse 19 and provided his guests with their robes. Well, the victim of treachery, Samson left his wife and returned to his father's house. Yet, in his absence, his wife's father gave his wife, Samson's wife, to his companion, that is, in verse 20, his best man. Well, that brings us to Judges 15. And here we have the story of betrayed and bound. When time passed and his rage dissipated, Samson returned to his Philistine wife and learned she had been given to another man. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 2. Now, fearing Samson's response, her father offered him his younger daughter, but Samson was determined to have his revenge. And so we find Solomon's revenge, or Samson's revenge, in verses 4 and 5. And so Samson went out. He captured 300 foxes. Scholars suggest they were jackals that inhabited the area, even to this day. He bound their tails to one another, placed a fiery torch between them. Afraid of the fire, the foxes ran wild through the fields of the Philistines, burning their wheat, their vineyards, and their olive trees. Well, that brings us to the barbarity and fury of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines responded to Samson's revenge, and we read that they killed and burned not only his wife, but also her father in verse 6. Well, threatening vengeance, Samson took the jawbone of a donkey, and we read in verses 7 through 8 that he slaughtered many Philistines. Well, that brings us to verses 9 through 17. Now, here we have the reproach of Samson's countrymen, the men of Judah. Now, the Philistines responded to the slaughter of their people by rallying their warriors and invading Judah. Well, the men of Judah, when they learned the provocation of the Philistine invasion was to capture Samson, they raised 3,000 men. Now, those men made their way not to the Philistines, but to Samson, and they reproached him. They asked, "Knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? What is this that thou hast done unto us?" Well, Samson defended his actions, and he said in verse 11, "As they did unto me, so have I done unto them." But then, with a promise that they would not harm him, Samson surrendered to the men of Judah, who bound him with 2 new ropes, brought him to the Philistines in verses 12 and 13. Bound, led away by 3,000 men of Judah, Samson came into the encampment of the Philistines. And then his enemies rejoiced and they scorned him in verse 14. At that moment, we read again, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon Samson, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. Verse 15, and he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, and took it, and he slew 1,000 men therewith. But the bodies of the Philistine soldiers were so many, we read in verse 16 that they were stacked in 2 heaps. Well, a closing thought for you. In Judges 15, we conclude with the observation that Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. Now, our following study will take up the tragic history of the last days of Samson's life. Tragically, we will see that the champion of Israel will follow the lust of his flesh. He will fall and come to ruin. And yet, we also read, though, in fulfilling the word of the Lord concerning his life's purpose, in that his death brought a greater deliverance from Israel than he did in life. Well, thank you for joining me for our devotional today. Another will follow as we continue the story of Samson. God bless you, and bye-bye.